Good, recording is in progress. Welcome to another webinar of CREO, the Online Institute about Origins. Today, the topic of our webinar is feathers and hair. Now, you might be wondering, what does this mean? Well, why don't I show you by sharing my screen. And I will begin from the beginning of the slideshow. Now, I hope you can all see this. Feathers and Hair, the CREO webinar for January 18th, 2023. Hair is something, of course, we're all familiar with. We're partially covered in it. As mammals, it's one of our defining characteristics. But what about feathers? Feathers, of course, are features unique to birds. But how are feathers and hair related? Many people look at birds and say, oh, well, birds have feathers and we have hair. We and other mammals have hair. Are feathers just different kinds of hair? Or is hair just some different kind of feather? And the answer is so interesting that I thought it would be worth talking about today. What does hair do for you, for mammals? We're exposed to it all the time. We cut it, we shape it, we color it. We look at other people's hair because it's an expression of their personality. Hair is fascinating because it has an origin that is somewhat unexpected, but it is related to this image. It's related to whiskers. The structure of hair is different from that of feathers. And that's shown in this diagram here. I hope you can see my cursor. Here I'm going to point to, actually I can do this. And there. The structure of hair shown right here. Hair, of course, erupts from the skin like this. But underneath the skin, in the hair shaft, the hair is lubricated by this gland, the sebaceous gland. And then there's a hair root here that's encased in a sheath. Notice a few things about hair. Hair has a small muscle attached to it. That's an important clue about the origin of hair and what hair is useful for. A muscle obviously controls movement. Therefore, hairs ultimately had control, movement control by the body. Even if nowadays our hair, like the hair on my face or on my head, the rest of my body, is something that I cannot control. Occasionally, we experience this when we say that the hair stands, like for instance, when you get a chill or a shock, your neck hairs stand on end. Well, that's where this muscle comes in. So the hair has some intrinsic muscle control. Another thing about hair, which is really fascinating, is that at the base, at the root of the hair here, is the dermal papilla. So these are blood vessels that connect to the hair. Along with these blood vessels is a nerve ending. So clearly, hair grows, but it also has a sensory function. Now think about it. Hair is ornamental, because we look at it, obviously. Hair has patterns and colors and shapes, different kinds of hair, depending on where in the body the hair is. And this is true for just about all mammals. But hair also has control, muscle control. It's fed by veins, and it's connected to the nervous system, which is a clue that the origin of hair is as a sensory organ. That hairs were used originally for organisms, early mammals, to find their way around, for instance, in confined spaces or in the dark. This is different from that of feathers. Feathers, shown here on the right, in the structure of a feather. Feathers, of course, have this vein and then a shaft, and then a barb after shaft, after feathers, quill, and so on. Feathers are not attached to blood vessels, nor are they attached to nerves. Feathers are ornamental. They do provide insulation. And of course, in birds, they provide lift for flight. But they do not serve the same function that hair does in terms of being a sensory organ. So let's take this a little bit further and talk about the origins of hair. This is a familiar organism to anybody who collected dinosaur toys as a child. This is Dimetrodon. First thing is Dimetrodon was not a dinosaur. Dimetrodon was from a group of organisms that lived in the Permian about 300 million years ago, known as the synapsids. They had a skull shape like this, a skull shape similar to our skull shape. In fact, this is the mammal skull type, the so-called synapsid. Now, Dimetrodon was not a dinosaur, nor was it a reptile. It was a sort of pre-mammal, an early kind of mammal. That's why our image of Dimetrodon has changed from this naive, albeit colorful view, to this. It seems that Dimetrodon had whiskers and some downy hair covering its body. Sure, it had reptile-like characteristics, but then there are some mammals that have reptile-like characteristics. For example, rats. A rat tail has a texture of its skin that seems reptile-like, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. But I think that this image changes your childhood view of that beautiful fan-tailed dinosaur thing that is termed Dimetrodon to something that is more accurately described as a pre-mammal. Dimetrodon, it seems, had a nocturnal lifestyle, and that might explain why it had these features in the front here, whiskers, for which there is some evidence, and that it lived in deep and foraged through deep litter and underbrush in forests. Here's a close-up of a Dimetrodon skull. So Dimetrodon was a pretty large animal. I mean, this skull would be about this big at our scale. But here you can see the synapsid type skull structure. Here's the eye orbital here. Here's this hollow in the back of the skull. near where you might consider the ear would be. Here's the nose, the nostril hole, and then these teeth. Careful analysis of some remarkably well-preserved Dimetrodon and Dimetrodon-like mammal-like reptiles or pre-mammals show fascinating pore-type structures in the front part of the skull, which have been interpreted by some paleontologists to mean that this is where the whiskers grew out and were connected by nerve endings and blood vessels to the body. This really changes the view of Dimetrodon. So hair. Here are some rodents on the left, like a beaver or a capybara or a squirrel or a mouse, and possums on the right. These organisms use their hair not just for insulation, but for finding their way around, for instance, in the dark. Take a moment and touch your hair with your hands. And if you have facial hair like I do, touch your facial hair, your beard. You'll feel your hair. Without touching your skin, there's a response. I think that is a great example of a test that you can perform just to show for yourself that hair is a sensory organ. It's used for tactile sensations. In the dark, you have long whiskers, like these opossums over here, or, for example, like this mouse, you can navigate in tunnels and pipes and other confined spaces in the dark. You can have a sense of your surroundings just by having an extension of your senses in the form of hair, exploring the space around you and giving you a sense of the confines of your surroundings. I think that this is the origin of hair, that hair was originally used by organisms like mice and their ancestors, the pre-mammals, to forage around with a nocturnal lifestyle. This foraging is extremely useful because it means that you don't rely just on eyesight for finding your way around or smell. You have an extra dimension available to you. Pretty soon, this hair is found to be quite useful if it covers the body, because it serves not just as a more complete sensory organ of the surroundings, but also as a means of temperature regulation, conservation of energy, insulation. In other words, warmth. The Permian world, 300 million years ago or so, the end of the Paleozoic, was undergoing profound changes. We talked about this in a previous webcast, where the origin of conifers, of evergreen trees, in the Paleozoic world, thanks to Pangea, is still expressed today in the forests at high latitudes, high altitudes, and dry desert environments where conifers proliferate. End of the Permian, at the time approaching the Great Permian Triassic extinction, wherein 95% of species went extinct. That was the environment of these pre-mammals like Dimetrodon that we talked about. Dimetrodon, if it had a nocturnal lifestyle, what more and more paleontologists are beginning to think, seems that that may have given these organisms an evolutionary advantage which allowed them to survive this extinction event. Because at the end of the Permian, as sea levels fell catastrophically due to buildup of ice, as Pangaea, part of Pangaea slipped to the South Pole, and also it began to break up to increase weathering and deposition of organic matter, therefore drawing down CO2, you had a drop in temperature. Volcanism over here in the so-called Siberian traps and in the East Asian volcanic province changed the atmosphere, causing further cooling. So if you were adapted to a nocturnal lifestyle for foraging and your body was covered in hair, you could very well survive such an environmental change. So hair has a multifaceted origin. And as I said, hair comes from this group of animals, the synapsids, which have a skull shape like this: eye, ear, nose, eye, ear, nose. That's different from another branch of vertebrates called the diapsids over here on the right. Eye, nose, two holes. Diapsids, two holes in the skull. The diapsids, of which reptiles are a member, of which dinosaurs were a member, of which birds are a member, like this emu over here. Birds and many, if not most, of the dinosaurs have feathers. Feathers are different from hair. Feathers seem to have started kind of hair-like from a modified scale. Of course, reptiles have scaly skin. Preservation of some dinosaur flesh and skin imprints show a kind of scaly type skin. Modification of a scale here into a horn-like structure or thread is thought to have proceeded somewhere along these lines. Think about a form that's like this, which with a small change to a developmental timing gene can split into two. And then each of these then splits into two. And each of these then splits into two until you get a kind of fractal pattern. In this case, the development more and more of feather-like structures. Feathers are diverse, but they have certain key common elements to them. This is some of that scaly skin that I mentioned. This material is called scutes. A scute is one of these kind of scaly skin type structures. Very, very common in birds and bird feet, and in some other parts of birds, like around the neck and so on. This particular picture comes from an alligator, which is something that many scientists consider as relatively close to the dinosaur type. And as I mentioned previously, certain rodents like rats, for instance, rat tails, also have scutes, this scaly type appearance. And it's thought that feathers arose from modification of this kind of scaly skin. This water dragon here shows some of these scales with, as shown down here, the throat area of the water dragon, less scale and more kind of horn or spike-like structure. So the idea is that in stage one, then you have an evolutionary change towards a modification of that spike, ultimately leading to the emergence of feathers. Feathers are quite ancient. They're as ancient as hair. But feathers are with the diapsids. Hair is with the synapsids. Hair and feathers, the beautiful diversity of feathers here, one could argue, is at least as matched in beauty in the diversity of hair types shown here in this diagram. Birds are beautiful creatures, fabulously diverse, with very, very interesting social, familial habits. Feathers and hair, each of which have a separate origin, no less fascinating knowing what that origin is and its relationship to geology. So that concludes our presentation entitled Feathers and Hair. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, contact us at creo.space. And I look forward to meeting with you again very, very soon. Bye-bye.